Hello and welcome to episode number 11 of Performing Labor. My name is Rob Simons, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. We'll unpack their training, their practice, and their careers, how they got started, how they stay sharp, and their ambitions for the future. And it's my hope that these interviews will provide value no matter where you are on your musical journey. If you're an aspiring musician, a working musician, or if you're a music lover and just curious to learn more. This week I sat down with Philadelphia native, graduate of Curtis and Juilliard, the principal horn of the Phoenix Symphony, and my good friend, Gabe Kovach. Gabe and I worked together for many years when I was still a member of the Phoenix Symphony, and we've stayed close ever since. So that being said, I wasn't exactly sure what would anchor this conversation. On one hand, I know many of the things that animate Gabe, and I know most of his career highlights. But on the other, the individual institution circumstances shape you differently, and it has been more than a decade now since I was in that orchestra, and a lot has changed there and in the industry. It's required a lot of flexibility from all of us. Gabe self-identifies in this interview as a gym rat, meaning he's at home in the fundamental, technical, and solitary work of the practice room, always getting stronger, always getting better. And that certainly makes him a great principal horn player, someone who has to go out and walk the high wire each night. But as you'll hear, it's only a fraction of his story. Gabe is as serious an artist and instrumentalist of anyone I know. And given his commitment to craft, what struck me about this conversation was his emphasis around education and community. My mother was a public school teacher, and she likes to say the responsibility of any teacher is simply to get the student from point A to point B. But the science of teaching is to define those points, and the art is to figure out what each individual student needs. Listening to Gabe describe both his own teaching and his time as a student, the give and take of teaching and learning, is something more than knowing your way around the practice room. Its richness is in its collegiality, connection, and community. And this holds true even when teaching over Zoom during a pandemic. And especially moving is how he recounts his time with his teacher and mentor, the late Jerome Ashby, and how through his guidance, Gabe began to find his artistic voice as a student, had a sounding board early in his career, and had a model for himself as a person and a player. I think sometimes we can over-individualize that process of finding your voice. The ratio of ingredients is unique to each player, but it's largely rooted in an intergenerational dialogue. The American essayist and journalist William Zisner captured that idea. Quote, "So it came about that I found my true style when I was in my mid-50s. Until then, it more probably reflected the person I wanted to be perceived as, the youthful and witty columnist and critic. But that person was never really me. Not until I became a teacher and had no agenda, except to be helpful, did my style become integrated with my personality and my character." Close quote. I certainly didn't find my individual voice until I became a useful and helpful member of an orchestra. And what Gabe seems to get at is an institution finds its voice through being helpful as well. There's a concept called adaptive leadership theory, which says that any individual, no matter their place in an organization or society, can practice both formal and informal leadership. But the key distinction is that adaptive leadership is not a technical practice. A technical problem can be solved with subject matter expertise, but an adaptive leadership challenge requires feeling your way through a collective problem. That means confronting difficult truths, revealing uncomfortable frictions, but without breaking the group apart. And there's no handbook for this kind of work, and it's not the kind of technique we can test for at auditions. Towards the end, we get into how auditions might change, and how continued training might evolve after the audition is won. Gabe phrases it as self-worth beyond the instrument, that promoting the curiosity and skills of the individual player will lead to greater institutional effectiveness. We usually think about that in terms of how an orchestra plays, or what it programs, but Gabe describes something different. The Phoenix Symphony has become much more community-centric over the past decade, one with a health and wellness focus. The adaptive leadership practiced by the musicians was born in the last economic crisis and has taken years to take hold. And as you'll hear in this interview, they now have a new executive director, Suzanne Wilson, who shares that vision. In the interview, Gabe's description of that community work prompted me to reference a quote by the essayist and heart surgeon Atul Gawande, written only days after the 2016 presidential election. I've thought about those words many times since, and I wanted to read them here. Quote, "The helping professions will stand by their norms. Yes, those with bad or erratic judgment will make bad or erratic choices, but it's through the smaller scale institutions of our daily lives that we can most effectively check the consequences of such choices. The test is whether the gap between what we preach and what we practice shrinks or expands for the nation as a whole." Please enjoy this conversation with Gabe Kovach. Gabe Kovach, welcome to the podcast. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
So we're recording this in late July, and obviously we're still in the midst of the health crisis. And you are the principal horn of the Phoenix Symphony, and you've been an active participant in a lot of the digital and online campaign that the orchestra's been doing. You're my second guest from the Phoenix Symphony so far on this podcast, so I don't want to necessarily go back over that initial response of the orchestra. If anyone's interested, they go back and listen to the very first episode of this podcast.
Sure. Yeah.
So I want to hear where you are, where the orchestra is now, what you're working on as a group, and kind of how you're looking forward through the rest of the summer and into the fall.
Yeah, you're catching us really at a sort of transition time because we are on our natural hiatus from the season right now, and then about 6 weeks out from what would theoretically be the start of our season. But as I'm sure you know, and every other organization is dealing with right now, what that looks like and where we're going and all the different safety protocols that we could have in place. But I think the summer's been sort of a blessing and a curse all at the same time because we don't own our own hall. So that gives us the ability of time because, one, we can't make our own decisions until the city tells us certain things. But at the same time, it gives us the ability to start to try to be creative about what the season can look like. Right now, I'm on a lot of the committees. We are setting ourselves up with a bit of realism coming up that, we're not like other organizations. We're not going to be able to do things until January, but nothing's official and they haven't announced anything. So we're a little bit in limbo right now on being able to make decisions. And I think as a musician base right now, everybody's just waiting for what it's going to look like. And that's just a hard sort of transition place for people to be in.
Most people listening to this would probably know Phoenix has been hit pretty hard recently by the outbreak. Has the severity of the recent outbreak changed your guys' plans? I mean, did you have a different picture of how the summer was going to look or the fall perhaps was going to look, and this has changed your thinking?
I think if you asked the same question back in May, there probably was a bit of optimism that, one, we're not getting hit the way other places are, and the locale of how we are situated, we're not as condensed. So we were probably thinking, I'd say in May, that there's a hope that we could, even if it's distant, start to do some things in September because we had that time. And I think right now with the way that we're getting hit, I'm just speaking personally. I'm not speaking in a way that I know anything that's happening right now because that meeting is actually a week from now, that I just don't see how we can come back right now with where we currently are to put things up in September. I just see January as that start date. Mm-hmm. And I don't see a lot right now where it looks like, just in terms of mapping out the time, that we could actually get to a place where we could do things in September. But there's just no way.
Yeah, the Phoenix Symphony is an interesting and maybe not the only group in the country that functions this way because of the weather. But, here in Rochester, we're talking about with some seriousness about being able to get out and do some concerts in the fall and late summer because the weather is such that we can do that here. Then in Phoenix, it's like you can't have a summer season, an outdoor summer season. It's just too hot.
No, it's still going to be mid-90s in October.
So you actually do have the potential, I suppose, as things get later in the season to be able to host quite a number of outdoor concerts where the rest of us would be buried in snow.
Yeah, I think we need to look at it in sort of the reverse time, right? This is our snowy season right now.
Exactly.
And the good time would be November through May, but the realistic part of how this pandemic is actually going to affect us, we don't know.
How has it affected you as an individual artist? How has it affected your practicing and your relationship with the instrument?
It's, if I get one good practice in a day session, that would be wonderful. I think the hard part really is the effect because of the family, right? So the the schools are off, and so in March I became daddy daycare. My wife was still working remotely because she works in the biopharmaceutical industry, so all their work became remote. She's working from home. Schools are off, so my days became dedicated to online teaching with the kids. And so at the end of it, once they're safely tucked away in bed, and that was our priority, is keeping the kids safe, for me, the instrument became secondary. Mm-hmm. And then there's this mix, especially in the beginning, of looking at it. It's like you get all this digital content coming out. And I went through this period early on, and it, like, oh, I've got to be doing this. Oh, I have to be doing that. I see these posts on Facebook, and people are doing all this a cappella stuff, and people are really plugging out a ton of content. And there was this, jealousy/envy factor that I wasn't able to do it. But at the same time, I was like, this is not the time for me to be doing that. I have these other priorities. So as the content was being, pushed out and people were showcasing the things that they're doing, there was this desire for me to be more active. I have to do this, I have to do that. But it actually was able to ground me where my priority was right now. And that had to be family, and rightfully so. And so with that being the focus, practice sessions got diminished, time with the instrument, the horn was on the shelf for a while, which was an okay thing.
So when you say you get one session in, so what are you working on?
Maintenance. For me, it really wasn't about advancing new literature or working on pieces that I wanted to get to, which of course I did. It was more just being able to stay in shape, go through my routines, ground myself in the fundamentals. So if things, especially when we're talking about March and thinking, well, maybe we could come back, maybe this would happen, really making sure that I was in shape for if that day came, I could jump back on. So my daily routine was lessened, but it was more focused towards service of fundamentals at that point.
It should be noted, though, that you have made some videos. You have made some playing videos with your section, I believe, right? So those for me, I've noticed that there have been these ebbs and flows. If you have a online project or you want to put something out in the world, that you have this expectation of an audience and you work up to that, but I haven't been able to sustain that. I've had more ebbs and flows than I've ever had at any point in my career.
Yeah, and with those things that we have put out, a lot of it was practicing just for that, to get through it. I mean, in one of the videos, if you see it, there's a big bandage around my finger because I was working out in the yard while I had the kids, and I sliced my finger open and then had to go get 5 stitches in it. So I just started practicing for one of the symphony events that we were able to put out, and you'll see me playing with a huge bandage around my finger.
I'm glad you're okay.
Yeah.
One of the things that came up in the last interview I did was that when this all first started, a lot of us, I think, had this idea that, we can really get back to basics. We can get back to first principles, maybe, spend a little extra time with etudes, build stuff back from the beginning. I think that's a good instinct. But in the absence of having a live audience on the horizon, like there's a really short shelf life on that. And it ends up getting taken over by just the reality that there's so much uncertainty going forward. Did you find that digital campaign you guys embarked on, because you guys put out a lot of content, did it give you a way to anchor yourself at all during these past few months?
It gave me some projects that I was focused on, which was nice because a lot of it was sort of choose your own adventure on what projects do you want to do. And so there's still some things that have not been released where we, 5 or 6 projects, some donor events that we're doing just for private donors where we're making videos for them. So those projects that we've put out gave me something to think about for the future, that I've got to stay in shape for this. So my practicing, to be honest with you, actually, I'm sort of a gym rat in the sense that I love etudes. So it did give me the ability to actually do the thing that you were talking about, where I could go to basics that way, because it's always sort of been, that is my fundamental practice routine in the first place. So it was the one thing that I had to really rely on was that.
Interesting. So you are staying busy. You are teaching at the Curtis Summerfest this summer. Is that going on right now?
It is going on right now. They're in the middle of the second week. It's a 3-week festival. usually live and in person in Philadelphia. But this year they decided to do it remotely. And I have to give them all the credit in the world because they created a remote festival from nothing. They didn't have the platform set up. And they did all the work in the world to still provide this festival for the masses. And I think it was a huge success.
You're saying it's a success from a technical standpoint, but also from an artistic standpoint too.
Both. One, that they were able to get it out. I mean, this year there were 8 horn students. Usually there's for the past 3 seasons, there is a roughly 4 to 5 horn students. So that it got greater reach than I expected. You know, one of the horn students was in Costa Rica, one of them was in Canada. So the digital age really presented a boom where you can get your tentacles out there in a greater reach than you could with people because they need to fly to a place or they need to get themselves, you know, there's finances involved with the whole thing where, yes, there's still finances involved to attend it, but, you know, there's other considerations that are mitigated by being able to have the digital platform.
That's amazing because that's the thing that seems to be the optimist calling card, right? To say, oh, we're going to reach so many more people. And we have now the world as our audience, but it doesn't actually seem to be that way. Or at least hasn't played out that way in practice. So to hear that you have, doesn't sound like if anything, the enthusiasm has not been diminished, it's been augmented. And you actually are seeing like being able to provide a valuable online experience for people.
Well, even more so too, because now when a lot of these festivals and the things that we count on being there in the summer aren't there was this huge desire to get that somehow, some way. And so I think the fact that it was there and available to people, you could see that there was a hunger for it. And there definitely was to be able to also be on the opposite side, providing something for somebody.
A hunger for what, Gabe?
Access, connecting, being a part of something, collaboration. And those things it's funny how the COVID situation has presented in the absence of it, the desire for more of the thing that you're missing.
A couple of my guests that I've had on so far are college professors. And one of the things that has come up in those 2 interviews was that because the quality over Zoom is a little bit diminished, to put it mildly, they're pre-recording their solo pieces or whatever it is they're working on. And then they're watching the performance together, right? So you're watching it with your student and the professor online. You're watching this fairly polished performance. And that has opened up a whole new gateway to picking apart the performance because it kind of gets rid of some of the nerves that comes into the lessons and it gives you an added opportunity to discuss things. Have you seen any innovations that you think might stick in terms of your teaching and in terms of the way you handle students going forward?
Oh, absolutely. It's been really, well, one for me, we haven't done any of the pre-recording in all my teaching, be it my private students or with Curtis's Summerfest. I haven't done what you had just said about recording with a student and then having them play. It's all been live. But I think what that has done for me as a teacher, one is it's really made me watch my wordiness with things and how I'm conveying something to a student so that they are understanding it in a way that it's digestible. Because otherwise, without that in-person, in vivo work that you're able to do, you know, you can't, the same room doesn't create the same sound. You're not next to the person. You can't see things as well. So it's really made me be more articulate with what I said and making sure that the student on the other end, I'm asking a lot of times, does this make sense to you? Give me some verbal feedback on what you're experiencing if I'm losing you somewhere. And so the communication has actually, I think, been better because of it. Now there's sound issues to deal with, but it's really made me watch my words and make sure that I'm being more clear of my ask to the students.
So maybe it's even just increased your efficiency as a teacher.
It's enhanced my awareness because you're paying attention to different things that you necessarily wouldn't deal with in a live situation. So I'm monitoring what they're doing on the video greater than I would in a room where I'm more concerned with listening sometimes, because you have better visual on the Zoom than you do audible. So it's created a different pathway to focus on a different sense than the audible side of things.
Interesting. I just started this new book, Maria Konnikova. She's got this new book about learning to play poker at a high level as an adult. And something you just said popped into my memory, that when she first met her coach, who is a top level professional player whose name escapes me right now, she asked for like, what is the most succinct advice you can give to someone getting started in playing poker? And he said, pay attention. And I think that's it's such a self-involved thing that we do. I mean, we're trying to control our own bodies, and perhaps there's an inefficiency in traditional teaching where you are so tied up in the sound that you overlook these other characteristics. Anything come to the surface in terms of like the physical part of playing? I know that the horn is such a unique instrument, but I would think that if you're teaching a lot and you're seeing yourself a lot on the screen as a string player, it might influence the way, like you might get a little bit more feedback about how you look. I mean, are you seeing something like that?
You do, and especially most of my students, I'll have them sit so I can see a lot of their left hand, so I can see that physical side of it, but you'll also lose, right hand position. So there is that drawback that the physical setup, you're just looking at a two-dimensional screen, so you don't get that 3D perspective. So that's been a little bit of a challenge, but at the same time, again, what it has keyed me into is in the watching more intently, I've been asking them, because I think what ends up happening too a lot is I say something to a student and I hear them do it right afterwards. And I think because I've said it, that I get this result. And so one of the check-ins that I've had a lot now with the students that I haven't done before is, instead of assuming, and I've asked them, I said, sometimes I think I've said it, and therefore since I've said it, yeah, I hear a difference, but I'm really cognizant now to check in with this new digital format that I'm not just perceiving my own idea of what I think it has just happened, and really checking in with them that this awareness factor, did it really change anything with them? And getting them to articulate if they're feeling a difference from it, because sometimes the sound doesn't translate that I've actually heard what I want to hear. And so now after I've said something to them, it may sound very similar to the time before, but you can see or hear a different side of fluidity. And so now, instead of assuming that it's working because you really can't with the sound, keying into verbally, is it working? And that's been a very different teaching style than being in an ambient environment where you can hear that something has changed or something is working better.
Mm-hmm. So when you think back to your own schooling, so particularly in college, how do you think you would have handled this time? I mean, how do you think you would have been if you were a student in this situation?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question, because
I ask Gabe because, sorry to interrupt, I ask you only because I know that you did take a lot of ownership over your private lessons in school, right? You had to make some hard choices when the institution kind of went in a different direction than you were intending or what you had thought. So, you're kind of the kind of a player that grabs the situation by the horns. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I know it's a bit of a weird question, but I am curious if you could think through some of the coping mechanisms that you might have had on the other side if you were the student in the situation.
Let's put a little bit of context to what you just said. I mean, when I was in school, my relationship with my private teacher wasn't the best. And I would say a lot of people that have studied with Meyer and Bloom would also say that they had tough goes of it. But Curtis, being the size that it was, at that time they only had one teacher. So I felt that it was incumbent upon me to seek out other people, not because it wasn't there at the school, but seeking out other people was studying with Michael Eliason, who was the director of the opera department at the time, or going up to New York and taking lessons with Julie Landsman. That was just something I felt I needed to do for myself, because I needed to hear other voices and other perspectives. And I think in a similar fashion now, my hope would be, even in good times, people would be seeking out other voices, especially now as we're talking about how the digital age should be able to connect us to people. That availability, now you don't have to fly to 5 hours to get to see somebody. You can hit the button. And so I think that if people are out there thinking about how this digital age can be beneficial to them, it's about access. And I hope people would take advantage of the access that's there. There shouldn't be anything to stop somebody from being able to give a lesson no matter where you're located.
It's interesting to kind of project forward. Hopefully we'll have a vaccine in the reasonably near future, and we'll be able to resume something more or less like we had in 2019. And I think some of that will be a reluctance to hop back on planes as quickly as we used to, not because we're afraid, but because it's not fun. It's not an enjoyable experience. It's a huge expense. But the video lessons aren't new, and they haven't really caught on until they were a necessity. So I'm wondering if they will. I mean, obviously the technology is cheaper than it was before, and we have access in our living rooms like the way we're doing right now.
I think where this is going to take us is, I was told the story, if Poland had this whole infrastructure debate. And so their telephone lines and everything else was just so antiquated, but it would cost so much money if, as a country, they were just to redo everything with top of the line, hardwired infrastructure. So they just, as a country, pretty much went digital. Mm-hmm. And I think where we are right now is going to showcase that we can't stay and just try to do what we did before. We can't just put down, hard lines again. That it can't be this expectation that people just come back afterwards to our concert halls in the physical sense that they did before. And so I think as we go forward, our industry is also going to look, in a sense, to not that it's going to be all digital, but now that we have this, using this as accessibility to showcase what your strengths are here in Phoenix or wherever you are, but to be able to broadcast out to everybody else.
That's an interesting analogy. I'm thinking, obviously the metaphor in terms of being hardwired, I think is good in that we are a tradition-bound workplace. We're a tradition-bound organization. I'm curious if you might think forward about how this might disrupt the college experience, and not the college experience, but how it'll affect the way we lay out colleges. Because I kind of think that, the conservatory experience is a weird fit, right? We fit this thing that is a lifelong pursuit into a few years to get people ready for a career, ideally, but it's often not enough time. And it's another conversation that I've had a few times on this podcast, that it's just that the 4 years, those 6 years are a little inadequate, let's say. And I'm curious about what you thought when you think back to your time in undergrad and grad school. What were the things that you thought were the most effective about that time? And what were some of the things that you would stress to the leadership of these schools now that they might want to change?
I think the first part of what you were saying earlier is hopefully this whole digital conversation is not about replacement, but enhancing. It's not something that's going to be a total, well, now everything needs to change, but now we have something else to add to the experience for that college student or for the freelancer or for somebody else. So I'm not looking at this time as a setback, but only something that's going to be added to the experience going forward. But in terms of me and my schooling, I feel like at that point, specifically to the time period that it was, graduating in 99 from my undergrad and 2001 from my master's, was this place where it was a bit of infancy on the musician not just being bound by one organization to provide everything for you. They were really dealing with, well, how are we creating a better student afterwards? And I think a little bit of that is also for the period where I was specifically in school. We were in the re-upping of our middle states accreditation. And so there was a lot of identity or self-reflection on who it is that we are, what type of student are we trying to create? Are we creating the best student to be the best at their instrument? Or do we have another service to the student that how are we leaving them when they're out of our 4 years or out of the 6 years that they may be? How are they set up for life in music if it's not going to be with a single employer? Which is really, really great, because what Curtis provided for a student was this environment where all they needed to focus in on was being the best musician that they could, providing them with everything that they needed to in-house. The downside of that is also when an individual of their mindset would become reliant on the institution providing everything for you. And I think what we started to see afterwards were students that weren't set up well if things didn't work out. And I think that's the self-reflection that they were doing at that point in time on, we have a greater responsibility to the students after they leave our doors because of the environment that we provide for them while they're here.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, is that institutional support early in your career. Because when you leave the doors of your institution, your academic institution, like it seems like, at least in my case, and I think a lot of our cases, it's just kind of, it's closed, it's gone. And that connection seems like it's severed, which leads me though to what I think is an interesting topic, which is those first few years out of school. Because at least for me, that was an incredibly rich time in terms of development. The combination of having 6 years of school with a great private teacher, all the really good elements of conservatory, mixed with having a little bit more time. I was in an orchestra that the Richmond Symphony, where we were playing 4 programs a week roughly, but 2 of those weeks were big orchestra, and those had nighttime rehearsals. And I basically lived in a practice room, learning the repertoire, getting ready for auditions. I had a mentor at the time for a good part of it who helped me immeasurably. So I want to hear about your, like, the formative work that you did outside of, after leaving grad school.
It was a very interesting place for me. One, because being from Philadelphia, going to school in Philadelphia, you're in a place where those that you admired and you looked up to and you had these aspirational desires to be like became teachers of yours after growing up in the orchestra, listening to them all the time. And then slowly, started subbing with the orchestra in 97 while I was still a sophomore in school. All of a sudden, these teachers are starting to transition to become colleagues. And I'm from the area, so then freelance work. So now you're working with all these people. And so I feel very, very fortunate that I was in a position, one, with family being in the city, connections being there, that I started to be able to build my world around me. And so when I was in New York, I was often traveling back to Philadelphia for most of my freelance work because that's where it was. And I wasn't able to do a lot of breaking in to the New York scene. It just didn't happen that way. But that was okay because I had lifelines in Philadelphia that I would just drive down to Philly and do a lot of my work or see my family. And then I was very fortunate while I was in New York that I started doing some subbing with Pinchas Zuckerman and the National Arts Center Orchestra, which became my first job outside of school for a one-year position. So all of those transitions on one, having your base, your hub, and moving into those next chapters felt like it was a little bit more seamless because I had locale really helped that, and I was very fortunate to have a job. I think the formative year really was when I didn't have that one-year position anymore.
All right, I want to get to that, but so you're saying about having these mentors or these people you looked up to as a kid becoming colleagues over the course of college and grad school. Did you kind of have like a mental model? Have you read that book, Peak, by Anders Ericsson? He talks about,
I haven't, no.
It's of all people should read it, but it's fantastic because it talks about like having just a mental model of somebody, how they do the job, or someone that does something that you want to be great at, even if you don't know that person, or if the person could be deceased. I mean, it could be from another historical period, and you kind of form a mental model of how that person would do the thing to help you problem solve through it. So you left Philadelphia or left school to go up to Canada and to play in that orchestra's principal horn. So I want to hear about how you made that transition, both psychologically and technically.
For me, that person, that model, that mentor was Jerome Ashby. Between my first and second years at Juilliard, I switched studios, and I was with Jerome's studio for the second half of that time. And he was the person that I just remember sitting back at my first lesson, and I came in, I said, okay, so what do you want to do? And he's like, no, what do you want to do? I was like, I don't know what I want to do. You tell me what I have to do, right? This is how it works. That's how it's always worked. You tell me what I do. I come in next week and I do the next lesson. And he's like, he calculated, he just looked down, he's like, we got about 16 lessons, roughly, or whatever the total was. I'm making up the number right now. But he just mapped out how much time we actually have together in physical 1-hour lessons. He's like, and then you're going to be out of here. He's like, so your time with me needs to be, who do you want to be? What type of person do you want to be? What type of musician do you want to be? So we made this deal that he's like, okay, fine. I know what you were there, what you went through with Bloom. So let's make an arrangement. I'll assign you one etude a week. Everything else that you bring to me is what you want to do for you, what you want to work on, and try to cultivate that voice. And so we spent a lot of time around that, which for me really was difficult to break down these things on trying to recreate my instrument for somebody else's liking. And so now I'm being asked to do something for myself. So it took a while for me to start to think about, well, what do I have to say? What do I want to do? And so he was the person that on the French horn side of things started to allow me to become the voice that I had inside myself. I just didn't know how to bring it out. But then the person that he was, you'd walk down the street with him. He'd ask you, about your life. How are things going? What are you doing? What are you into? He would just walk with you and talk with you. He didn't talk down to you. And he just treated you like an equal. It didn't matter that you were a student of his. And you saw this regardless of the age of the student. He just treated you like a person. And that hit me so hard about the idea on the person that I wanted to be afterwards and him as a mentor. And so when I was in Ottawa and then after the 1 year was done, I would check in with him all the time. Mm-hmm. And when I even got to Phoenix, and am I doing this right? But he was still that person of allowing my own voice to come out. But he was that mentor for me that transitioned French horn, life after French horn, and making those worlds come together so that you are as whole as a person as possible.
Tell me a little bit more about his playing career. So obviously he was a tremendous human being, and probably a lot of that came intuitively to him, but tell me about how he might have exhibited those characteristics in a workplace.
He was associate principal horn in the New York Philharmonic, and before that, when he was down playing in Mexico, met his wife in Mexico, had their family together, and then they lived in New Jersey. Most of his professional career was with the New York Philharmonic before he passed away.
So you took kind of his guidance, his example, and checking in with him when you went up to Canada. So tell me more about that first really high pressure experience playing in that orchestra.
Yeah, when I got there, it was a little bit of a mix because I assumed I was coming into a position that was just a 1 year job, and I was there for a 1 year position, and then I would be gone. The first piece that we played there was Ravel's Pavane for Dead Princess, which starts off with the beautiful horn solo. So there was definitely a lot of nerves about going into it, but I just figured, I'm here. I'm a placeholder. I'll do what I can. This is going to be a great learning experience. And very soon, I just got comfortable in my own skin there, and so it was a really wonderful learning experience for me to start taking the things that Ashby was talking about and use them up there. But again, I thought I was just there for a 1 year position. And then slowly, as I was there, the former principal who was out on medical leave officially announced his retirement. And so the position that I was there only as acting for the 1 year became something that could possibly be a career. Mm-hmm. And so how I had looked at the 1 year changed around the new year. I'm like, okay, now there's an audition. And so where I was relaxed in the beginning started to become pressurized because now everything needed to be perfect, because I always have this thing in the back of my head of somebody else is always going to look better because their faults, and we all have faults, won't be showcased on a daily basis the way mine would be. So I started to get tighter and tighter and tighter within myself. Not that anything was worse, it wasn't, but it was just one of those things where the pressures of the situation changed. And that was a really great learning experience for me to start to do a lot of the mental work that I had been practicing at Juilliard, put that into real world practice. Because before it was just, oh, this is great. It's a 1 year, love it. And then I'll be done with this. So you didn't have this care aspect with things that started to change mid-year.
That's really interesting. The kind of like the weather changed when like the clouds rolled in a little bit when that happened. So tell me about getting into sports psychology and performance psychology at Juilliard, was that a course that was offered, or was it just kind of something in the air that you picked up down there?
It was both. So when I was at Curtis going up and studying with Julie Landsman, she introduced me to Don Green. And I started doing a lot of Don Green privately. And that was in its infancy in this transition place between my senior year of Curtis and then when I went to Juilliard for my master's. And then when I was there for my master's, it was offered as a course. And so I took it as a course. And I don't know really how I felt about it as a course, one, or how I felt about it as a person at that time, because I didn't really see it until you have, the rear view mirror. And I think that the rear view mirror of it started to for me to be able to feel it and know that it was something that I needed for myself in absence of it. And so when the 1 year was done in Ottawa, I really saw the value of it for myself on needing it more. And it became I think really about 2002 was where I started to see it, not while I was in it. It was just too hard to see. Well, it was more a course, and then I got some value out of it, but I didn't see the true value out of it until I actually didn't have it.
As a teacher, do you demand that your students think about these things? I mean, is it in your mind? I mean, we all have a different relationship with our nerves. I, like you, feel that I have to really regulate my emotions and be really on top of that, particularly in an audition situation or high pressure situations. And I know some people don't feel that as acutely, but I feel that everybody could get more out of their practice, out of their time, out of their investment if they read some of the books that you gave me to read. So I'm asking you, do you treat it like scales or an etude for your students that is like, this is a non-negotiable, or is it on a case-by-case basis?
I don't think I treat anything as a non-negotiable with my students, but I try to, with them, throw out the information and see what sticks. And so I think it's a little hard to say, do this, and you specifically are going to get dividends, from it. So what I try to do with my students is tell them that they need to practice the mindful muscle as much as they do the physical muscle of their instrument. And I sort of try to throw out the things that I do. This is part of who I am as a player. These are the things that I do pre-concert. When people ask me, how do I practice? Then I talk to them on the incorporation on mindfulness and meditation and the Don Green and the sports psychology and some of the books. But I try more to just put it out there. And then you can start to see if it's clicking with the student and if they want to get more. But I feel like if I told them that they'd have to do it, you're going to get more resistance from it. Mm-hmm. Than it feeling like it's natural for them to want to have more of that in their system. So for me, I felt like if I was told to do something, I was more reluctant to do it because it felt more like an assignment. Mm-hmm. And if I was left to my own devices to search and find it for myself, or really feel that it actually was working, then I'm doing it because I want to and not because somebody told me that I had to. And so I try to do that same thing with my students, is see what they gravitate to. Because I think ultimately when I'm teaching, I'm trying to give them the information so that they can be their own best teacher eventually.
Does any of this mindful practice spill over into other parts of your life? Into your being a father? Does it spill over into your being a colleague or anything like that?
I think if anything during this time, it's made me more mindful that I need to be mindful. Mm-hmm. Because it's just one of those things that as I talk about it and as I say it, I realize I need to do more of it. A lot of what the mindfulness has done for me has taught me when I need it, and that I am more of the type of person that I use it specifically for an event. But what it's also taught me is that that's not the way I want to be. I want to have more of it in my life on a daily basis, because it's almost like, okay, well, I have a stressful concert coming up in 3 weeks, and then I start doing my meditations beforehand, which really isn't at all the way it should be used. It should be on a daily thing. Mm-hmm. So as you and I are talking about this right now, it's making me be like, oh God, I should go back and do more of the things that I talk about doing, because I, like anybody else, become complacent and I'm not doing as much as I should. And so when the frustrations boil over and you have, a rough day with the kids because there's, a lot going on, or you're trying to figure out how to occupy, 10 days, it is one of those things where I'm like, okay, you know what? I can be more mindful about this situation. It doesn't need to be about the thing that I'm neglecting right now, which right now has been the horn for a little bit of time, except for that 1 good hour that I'm getting a day once everyone's asleep, because they need me right now more than I need my horn. So there's this process of like, I feel like I'm losing a part of myself because I'm not able to practice the way that I want. But the mindfulness has taught me that what I'm doing with them in the day is so much more important, and trying to reorganize where my value is currently right now.
Let's use the family talk to pivot a little bit to your early years. So you grew up in a family of musicians. Tell me about what music was like and what it meant in your household.
My earliest memories are my dad practicing Clair de Lune. I totally just have this early memory on sitting on the stairs and hearing Clair de Lune from the piano. My mom's an oboist and my brother's a clarinetist, but they started both of us on violin. And so it was something that was omnipresent. But to my parents' credit, they never pushed music. Music was always something that was an extracurricular activity, and education came first. And if your grades weren't good enough, then the music could go bye-bye. And I always thought that was great, because then for me, I never felt that I was forced into doing something against my will. Again, this whole conversation on like, I try not to force it on a student, right? Because when it was forced on me, or if it was, I know I would have been reticent to do it, or there would have been a lot of pushback. So my parents also instilled during that time that music should always be a want and not a requirement. And so my love of finding myself going into music was natural, as opposed to being forced. But it was always there. But, you know, I grew up playing baseball, soccer, and music. It wasn't until about, I say I know that it wasn't until 8th grade when I had made that choice.
And how would you put your finger on how you made that choice? I mean, was it kind of a sudden blast of light that this is what I'm going to do, or was it a slow evolution?
I always loved it, right? You know, so like practicing the horn was just non-existent in the beginning. I remember there's like my teacher would have a chart, and I'd have to write in the chart how much I practiced. And it was 10 minutes. It literally was 3 minutes. It was 5 minutes. I did not like doing it by any stretch. But I guess at that early stage, people heard that I had some natural ability and talent on it. But my mom tells a story, and I distinctly remember it as well, that I went away to a summer camp in 8th grade. Well, I went 7th and 8th grade. And I went to the summer camp, non-music, just, you know, a 4-week summer camp. And I came back, and the first thing I did is I ran up to my room. I grabbed my CD of Herman Bauman playing Carl Maria von Weber's Concertina, and just listened to that. I just couldn't get enough of it. And that's where that switch was. And I think it was, again, one of these situations, we talked about it earlier, when the absence of it is there. It can be taken away from you with COVID, or the absence of it there being with a regular festival. When you don't have that very thing that is a part of your life is when you value it more, or you seek out the thing that has been taken away from you or not allowed to you. Music wasn't taken away from me. I had a great time at the summer camp, but it wasn't there for 4 weeks, and I was hungry for it. It was all consuming. And so from that point forward, there was a change in my practice habits. There was a change in my excitement level on the regional things that I was doing, or the orchestras. And then 8th grade, I was like, okay, I'm going to try to get into my youth orchestra. And everything in that summer between 8th and 9th grade is where that huge change happened.
So talking about having the thing taken away from you and projecting about how we might come back, one of the Phoenix Symphony's great successes, it seems like, in the past few years has been through health and wellness and education. And you guys got some really great media in Forbes magazine, and some local media attention for the really great work you've done. How do you see that as playing a role for future audiences and for future public service from the Phoenix Symphony when you guys do get back?
There's the logical question on, can we get back into these places? That's going to be the first thing. That's just, you know, a nuts and bolts type thing on, can we get back to doing these things? Because if we're at high risk, then nobody's going to want to put other people at high risk. Where it plays into us, or what we do going forward, I think it's paramount to who and what we are. And I think we found ourselves as the health and wellness platform for the Phoenix Symphony and our own community. It's one of the core things that we do. And so when we can go back into it, I think it will be that much more impactful to our community, because again, they haven't had it for a while. But I think if anything, it allows us to be community-based and adhering to our mission and vision statement. We took a lot of time after 2008, when we had the financial crisis, to craft a mission and vision statement that was true to what we wanted to do without the care or the thought to what another organization was doing, 2,400 miles away from us. And I think before that, we were more concerned on how we looked to the outside. Mm-hmm. And then when we recrafted this mission and vision statement back in 2008, 2009, we were more concerned with how does the Phoenix Symphony play in our community, in our radius, and provide for our community. And I think if anything, after all of this, you won't see a let up in those core programs that we've been offering to the schools, to the homeless, and to any of the organizations that we've been a part of. Because now, with all the work that we've done, we're sewing ourselves as not just something that's a niche or a novelty. Now it's a necessity to this community. And I think a lot of these organizations that have been relying on us to come in there, hopefully, my hope is that that value has been proven in the absence of us not being there.
I am thinking about a 10-year time horizon. I'm trying to think beyond before there's a vaccine. Like if we're in the pre-vaccine world, these orchestras, and you guys have been a leading light in terms of all the work you just described. And I was thinking of after the 2016 election, Atul Gawande, the surgeon, he wrote the Checklist Manifesto and a number of the books. He's a really fantastic writer, and he's a heart surgeon. But he had a line about how there will be helping organizations. And I think that the term helping organizations actually is a thing. Like, it's actually a descriptor of a lot of things in the health profession. But in this terms, it meant there are all kinds of people in the world that are helpers. And there will be people that make really bad and erratic choices, but it's the small scale institutions, smaller groups of people coming together, that are always going to fill the gaps left behind by the people who make bad choices on our behalf. And the real test is if those small institutions are, be they families, be they symphony orchestras, be they public schools, be they churches, can fill that gap. And it was a really meaningful thing to me. Obviously it's something I've carried with me for 3.5 years now, since I read it. But I think that it's especially pertinent now as we go forward, that we see ourselves as helping organizations first. And I really admire all the work that you guys have done. If you could speak to your own experiences in it.
As a community, the thing that we've been doing is for me, a lot of the programs that I've been doing have been going down to the homeless shelters, and we're playing for people that are literally living on the streets, and they're coming into these day shelters, and you see them come in, and you're providing, an hour of relief from their daily grind. And I think that this whole conversation, the health and wellness things that the symphony has been doing, and what we come back and looking like as a symphony orchestra, there's a great marriage between these two worlds on the orchestra not just being a concertizing orchestra, but the value that you're giving to a community where you are greater than just a symphonic orchestra playing great music. You have a different responsibility to your community. And I think that in all this work that we're doing, we are seeing us be a different entity than just a performing arts organization. Mm-hmm. When you can go downtown for an hour and provide much needed relief for people that are in dire straits. And they sit there, and these families that are coming in, we played St. Vincent de Paul, and you see families of 8 people sitting at a table, just not being able to have those concerns for the value, for that period of time that they're sitting there. And it makes you want to do more of this, and you realize that you have a responsibility greater than just playing the concert.
When I was in Louisville, we did quite a bit of outreach through the leadership of our music director, Teddy Abrams, and he would take music to wherever it was. Any place that would have him, he would go. And at first, I thought, from an institutional standpoint, it's like, is this the best use of your music director's time? I mean, one of the most precious commodities that a music director has is their time, because their demands on it are from all these angles. But he was persistent, and he has more energy than any other human I know, so that also helps. I followed him along on a few events, and we played some things together, and then we started organizing as musicians to go out on our own. And let's not overstate what we're doing here. We're not curing cancer. We're not offering material relief, but we are offering some attention. We are there as ambassadors of the cultural parts of the city to people that wouldn't normally receive that. And
I wouldn't want to negate the things that we are doing that actually have been proven on being able to recover better from disease by having music be a part of it. And the studies that are now coming out by the Alzheimer's research on the benefits of music to recovery. So even though we are not saving lives, on some level, we're providing something so somebody else can actually save their life, right? So you're giving them the ability to heal inside. And there's plenty of scientific data out there that what we are doing is not inconsequential.
I didn't mean to imply that it's inconsequential. I'm only saying that we are getting.
No, I didn't mean to say that you did.
The point I was trying to get to was that we receive something out of it too, right? So, and it's something that would be hard to describe to a younger version of yourself. That these events, kind of getting down on the floor with some kids in the Salvation Army, or meeting people that are coming in off the street for a meal or whatever it is you're doing, there's real payback in the organization to the players and to the staff that organizes these things, because it's not an insubstantial outlay of human resources to make these things happen.
But you touched on it earlier when you said that the most precious thing that you have is time, and I think that is the best allocation of your time. If that's the only thing that you have to give, then that's what you need to give.
Beautifully said. When I was thinking about Teddy and Teddy Abrams, that his example was really meaningful to me. That was someone the demands on his time are so significant. For orchestra musicians, a lot of our workday is self-directed, right? We have to schedule in our rehearsal time, or our practice time. We have to figure out our priorities during the week in terms of what we have to learn. We have to learn to weeks out. But a music director's time is being pulled in every direction. And he said, no, I'm going to carve X amount of time every week, and I'm going to go do these things. And he created an example that I think left a big imprint.
Did the association ask that of him, or did he choose that?
No. It's all him. When I left town to come here to Rochester and was saying goodbye to some folks I didn't know very well, and these are not musician people, these are people in my neighborhood, some school teachers that taught in fairly distant suburbs of Louisville remembered him coming there like 4 or 5 years ago, and like just his presence, the attention that he was giving these kids in lower income neighborhoods. And Louisville's a pretty segregated community, and he went everywhere, and it was really all about every place in the city. And I'm wondering though, if you think that when we talk about this payback, this sort of non-economic payback that we're getting from these things, is that a way we can measure success in an orchestra a little differently?
Yeah. I mean, this is, we were talking about it earlier. Our measure of success for me is going to be when we come back, that the organizations that we have been servicing of before, which, yes, there's certain metrics, there's certain grants that you get and you measure it against, is it financially viable to be doing these things? Because to do these programs cost money, they cost time. There's so many things that go into the production of actually getting there. But I think the true measure of success is when we come back, will those organizations ask us to come back? And if they do, and the hope is that they will, that's the measure of success, and the rest comes because of that. And so, when you're talking about, Teddy's involvement with the community and, what comes first, I think that's really where the alignments of the musicians, the mission and the vision, and what you bring into it as an association, that's where I really feel this work is happening, and really that stuff is happening here, where we are aligned that way, that we can actually go and do that and say it's part of our core, as opposed to it being something where you're feeling that it's forced on people. It's truly as part of what we do, and trying to live up to that vision and practice it.
Do you think that being able to identify helping activities like this, that it might help us internally get past some of our the built-in friction of our management labor stuff? So in other words, if we can think of something bigger than ourselves, bigger than the institution, do you think that might help smooth out some of our chronic problems in terms of shared governance?
One would hope, because then when you have these things that are aligned, the people that you're bringing in these positions, be it positions in musician side of things, or people that you're bringing in as administrators, that you're bringing in people that are of like mind because you already have these things crafted out. And we did a lot of hard work, I would say, in essence, 2 administrations ago, and it was difficult and there was friction. But when you start to develop the platform, the next generation is coming into something that's already in the works. So the ultimate goal is that this train has left the building, and now you're coming on to something that's bigger than all of us, but we're bringing in the right personnel to service that.
Right. So that I want to get to that. So that's a great point, that you guys laid this groundwork after the Great Recession and the restructuring of the orchestra. And after this, let's say 10 years or so, and some ups and downs, but a lot of successes. Let's not paper over that. But now you have leadership that is an expert in this stuff, like someone who's truly bought in to education and community service.
Yeah. 2008's negotiation, because of the timing. Yes, you know it well. And correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of that negotiation, because we were up against it, we are the first organization to take a 19%. We took the first cut, and it was 19%, with a 12% kickback that we forgave.
Right.
And so a lot of the things that we talked about at that time were non-monetary things that we needed in our contract, and a platform and a voice to be able to speak on. So we knew we couldn't get finances at the time, but we could get a greater place at the table. And so that's what we fought hard for. And so when we recrafted that mission and vision, which you are also very instrumental in, it's now that we're bringing in that next CEO, that look of it. And the shame of it is that she was onboarded in January and got hit with the pandemic on top of it. Yeah. So,
but it seems like, that these good decisions, even not being able to obviously predict something like what we're facing, it does feel like the work is sequential and that it's paying off over time for you guys. I'm curious. Yeah. I mean, it really, when I read about her, I mean, you were on that search, you were on the CEO search committee, were you not?
I was.
Yeah. I'm just super optimistic. And when I read about her background, and I thought, wow, this could be a great fit. And for the first time, in my, 15-year relationship with the Phoenix Symphony, we're going back 15 years or so, like nothing like that seemed like that set of ingredients hadn't been there. And I'm super optimistic about that.
We all are. And we feel really fortunate about her. I mean, it just feels like in this early going that it is the right partnership.
And as we think about partnerships and this sort of elevated role of the body of musicians, no individual musician necessarily, but the body of musicians taking on more responsibility. And I suppose the health crisis is actually accelerating that. You guys, so much of the digital media stuff is self-directed and self-organized. Do you see a different role or or an augmented role for board members?
It's a curious situation when talking about that, because I can really only talk about the experience that I've had with our board and seeing the change on a board that starts to resemble what the city looks like, a board that starts to be more involved with the responsibility of the orchestra to the community, where perhaps in the past it's been more of how do I look by being on a board for an organization, and being associated with an arts organization elevates my status in the community, where now your board involvement is really showcasing the orchestra to the community as opposed to elevating themselves. And so I've really seen a sea change in the past few seasons on how we have brought on new board members, and the right board member for the right vacancy, because all these committees and all these things has to have a board member attached to them. And so when we have vacancies on the board, we're really trying to see that the board member is also bringing a skill set to us that we can utilize, not just finances. And so I think as we go forward with board development, a cornerstone of that board development is actually choosing the right people to be on a board, not just because they have deep pockets.
Especially if the mission becomes more people focused. I think that the boards that I've worked with have worked with a lot of really wonderful individuals. But to your point, I think we bring them on often because they have deep pockets or they have some particular business acumen. And then many often don't necessarily have a deep background in classical music, and certainly not in nonprofit management. and we kind of leave them away from the core product of the mission of the orchestra, of the concerts, because like that's our domain expertise. But I think as these institutions can become more socially focused, what we're doing is more easily explained or more intuitively understood, perhaps is a better way of saying it, and that we can tap into those social connections that board members have around town to find more places to play, to find more places where music can be helpful. Because I think that board members, their personal networks are often the thing we don't necessarily exploit the way we should. So as the organizations go forward, do you see there might be a way these would influence our audition process?
One would think, to be honest with you, I don't know if I have an answer to it, but I think I have a lot more questions around it. And, if the audition process itself that we created it's been of great service, right? It's created this wonderful meritocracy. It's as best as we can cut out so many of the problems that there was before with age and race and gender. The problem that we've also created is this very sterile environment where we're not able to see a person for the other skill sets that they will bring to an organization that transcend the instrument that they play. And looking at our orchestra, not only as a well-oiled machine and proficiency on your instrument, but also a well-oiled machine and using skill sets you never knew that somebody has. So how do you look at it at an individual, that what they can bring to you, and would you try to change the platform so you could see more about the person? Should there be an interview process with it so you can see what drives a musician's passions outside of the stage and see how you can utilize that for your organization? If somebody has great community ideas, or if somebody's really involved with underprivileged children, or whatever they're doing in their life that's of importance to them, so that the association is also not only providing a job for the person, but a place that person can come in and hone that other part of themselves. Because I think as we look at the orchestra, there is a responsibility for us also as an orchestra, making sure that our constituents are not only whole financially, but whole as a person. And I think what gets cut gets left on the cutting floor is the idea of your own self-worth outside of the instrument. And I have more to offer than just playing the French horn. And so how do you incorporate that into your work environment?
It's an interesting and difficult question with no simple solutions. I think we can say that the audition experience or the audition process has been remarkably effective in some ways. Like you said, when we have the process, we put the process in motion, it generally fulfills its intent, right? We normally get a good hire, and it usually produces a good new citizen in the orchestra. And as we think about reforming it, though, to make our orchestras more representative of the populations that we serve, there's one school of thought that says, well, maybe we've reached a point of diminishing returns with the screen up, and we should do something perhaps like what you said and have an interview process. The flip side of it, though, is that we're a model for a lot of other institutions also in the pursuit of fair hiring. Right. So
yes,
we recognize that our intentions don't necessarily completely align with our outcomes, that we have the intention of being a completely meritocratic institution, but yet we keep hiring the same kinds of people over and over and over again. There's a lot of reasons for that. So some very smart people are saying, well, actually we probably get more rigorous with the process. Right. So people within music are saying it should be a blanket across a board that no orchestra pulls a screen down under any circumstances. And that actually aligns with some of the more rigorous scholarship around this, where in some high profile institutions, be they academic institutions or corporate America, if you're being hired by committee, now it's probably not blind, but it's still by a committee, they've taken away all discussion, right? You ask the exact same questions, you ask them in exactly the same order. So as they've taken they cite us as a success, and they've taken what we do and make it even more rigorous in an attempt to get greater diversity. And I wonder, before we throw the baby out with the bathwater with this, that we might want to not think, to recognize that we've actually been a leader in business in the way we've done this. We changed the way people see hiring.
You're absolutely right. And the struggle that I have, though, is, we've gotten on this topic about the service of your community. No one can tell you what your community needs except for the orchestra or the association in that locale. So going back to the conversation that we had about, the article in Forbes and our mission and vision statement on providing these things to our community and doing the homeless and the B Sharp program and all the great things that we are doing as paramount aspect of the Phoenix Symphony, if that's where we're going to continue doing, and then we're going to ask people to be in schools and be teaching artists, we either have one of two choices. We either have to change how we're looking at who we're bringing into us so that when we have vacancies, we know that somebody may have a skill set to do that, or that's not part of the equation. But when we bring somebody in, we have to have proper tooling for them so that they can become a great teaching artist. So do you look for the talent that is already there, or are you going to provide the teaching as an institution that's saying, we're expecting you to be out here as a third of what we do? So how do we then have a responsibility to the people that we're sending into a classroom to be the best teaching artist?
My intuition is the latter. My intuition says that we institutionalize it by making it a part of what we do once you get here. I think my reading says that we should make the audition process even blinder, but that when you get here or wherever you get to, that you're immediately part of your job is exactly what you said, that there are people in the institution that lift you up and lift up your skill set and develop your skills after the fact. I'm not saying that I'm right. I think, but that's my reading and my intuition lines up that way, that when we talk about what an institution does, an institution has to be the driver. I think of it. It can't be up to the person.
I think you're right on that as well. I mean, I'm just phrasing it as the question, but if there's an example to prove that point here too, we just decided to keep the screens up throughout the finals recently for auditions, where it was elected to for the screen to come down in the finals. I think that choice might still be there, but there's a preference for the screen to remain up throughout. So we became a little bit more rigorous in that as well. But I think then that next stage is going to have to involve, teaching how to become a teaching artist if we're not asking somebody to come fully developed that way.
All right, man. Well, look, I think it's a pretty good place to wrap up. We've covered a lot of ground here. But before we go, do you have any recommendations on books, music, movies, anything to check out?
For me right now, I'll tell you, if people want to get into a bit of the mindfulness training and they want it to be science-based because they gravitate to that, it's the new Toughness Training for Sports by James Lohr. That's like the go-to book to really get into it. Myself, I found The Art of Mental Training by DC Gonzalez to be a book that I really love because it's more in story form, and it is something that's digestible by somebody else's experience as opposed for it being science-based and how the mind works. So I think they're really great compatible books to each other, because the new Toughness Training for Sports gives you a lot of theory behind how it works, and The Art of Mental Training by DC Gonzalez puts it out in real life experiences that somebody has gone through. But if you're of the mindset where you're into the Eastern art of it, The Places That Scare You by Pema Chodron is a great book to start, that pathway of meditation and self-reflection. So those are the three sort of books that I go to on if I'm recommending somebody that just wants to start, researching for themselves.
That's great, Gabe. Thank you very much. I appreciate you making time.
Thank you, Rob, for having me.
Thank you for listening. The music on the show, as always, is by Craig Wagner, an incredible guitarist from Louisville, Kentucky. We'll be back soon with more interviews. The next one is a bit of a departure and features Karina Brown, who is the Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Utah and a passionate amateur violinist. So go ahead and hit subscribe.